No mai, hoki mai, kia the fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa. My guest today, Toby Manhire.
Wow.
Yes, that's how I feel when I see you each morning. We're gonna. This is the Tuesday analysis version of the fold, and indulgently, we're gonna start off by talking about our weekends. But there is a media reason for that, I swear, which will become clear. At least if it, I hope it will. Then we will talk about a recent editorial by Irene Gardner, who is the head of SPADA, the production guild, and as a way of sort of talking about the current state of New Zealand's production sector, and the appointment of one Philip Crump, former Fold guest and former editor of ZB Plus, to the board of New Zealand On Air, which is quite a fascinating topic. And then finally, something I've been meaning to talk about for a little while, which is the end of Matt and Jerry on Radio Hauraki, and Matt's move to ZB Afternoons as a way of kind of getting into the future of ZB, the different paths that it might take. But we're going to start with our weekends. Toby, tell me about yours, and let's see if we can land this plane.
You tell me about yours, I think, is the best place to start.
Okay, well, my weekend started on Wednesday, which is unconventional, I'll admit. So I was in Sydney for South by Southwest, did a panel.
South by Southwest in Sydney? Hang on a minute.
I've actually, this is really, really repellent thing to say, but I have been to both South by Southwests this year. Both
Why
Austin
did you
and
go
Sydney.
to the first one in Austin?
This is horrible. Well, because the Fold, this podcast you're listening to, was nominated for Best International Podcast. It lost appropriately.
Next year, this gold, it's going all the way to the top.
That's right. We've been in. Yeah.
Okay, so it's normally in Austin, but it has now this sort of spin-off event in Sydney. Is that what's happening?
That's right. It's a franchise. And this
are there other ones? Do you know? Is it,
no, as far as I'm aware, that it's Sydney is the other. I could be wrong. Actually, let's just. I almost think we should leave that in. just hang me out to dry.
I could
be wrong. I could be wrong. I do record this podcast without a laptop in front of me because I just like to go raw, which means that I can't kind of just sort of do that thing where you fudge a bit and fact check yourself along the way. But anyway, it's the second edition that they've had in Sydney, and yeah, we were on a panel there, myself, Lucy Blackiston, and from You Should Care About, and Chris Jans, who has should have been the CEO of Nine, but has now started a business news startup called Capital Brief, and it was hosted by Lee from Daylight. We had a great time, but yeah, I was. It's funny, right? Because you're at this event which is supposed to be all about inspiration. And it started out as a music festival. It's become more of a technology festival. But if you're a person who comes from creative / the kind of worlds that we operate in, when you're around that much of the sort of future-gazing kind of aspects of generative AI, it unavoidably can feel quite heavy and existential. And that was the way I felt for large chunks of it, I have to admit.
According to the South by Southwest website, they also have a London event, so that sounds good. You can do that to complete the trifecta.
Complete the set, yeah.
What was the in your own session? Was there a kind of overall thesis that you guys emerged with?
The event's title was for I think it's like for digital media for news media. Digital transformation isn't a process, it's a state. And it was basically about, because there's a lot of the time that gets talked about as legacy media has to go through a digital transformation, and it will start as legacy and it will be on the internet, and that will be solved. And I guess the thing that we were trying to advance was there is no finished state. You must always be in motion. You must always be making things and turning things down and just responding to the fact that, the nature of the internet shifts so fast and constantly that it requires you to kind of respond to that as a sort of from both a business and a kind of a cultural sense. So we spent a lot of time talking about the end of link sharing, which is something I talked about with Anna Rafferty Connell recently on this podcast. And but it was cool. The thing that I liked about it was it felt like we were extremely honest about the challenges this sort of new internet that's come into view represents.
And were people there interested in what's going on in New Zealand, or I mean, did you get a good crowd? Yeah,
I mean, the room was probably about. I mean, I'm just guessing at this stuff, but it was. I would say it was about 150 to 200 capacity, and it felt, 80-90% full, which on a Friday afternoon, I must admit to the kind of normal pre-party jitters of thinking, who will show up? The funniest part was actually before the event when the actual green room was full, so they ushered us to this VIP room, which was basically a table and chairs in a small room. But a couple of minutes after we sat down, a few guys came in carrying guitar cases and one of them pulled a guitar out and started to sort of tinker around on it. I'm like, oh, cool, this is some, it's a music festival as well. I was like, you've got some funny shoes on, mate, but that's fine. And then we sort of slowly twig, oh, that's the Wiggles. The original lineup of the Wiggles was like the podcast studio we're in now is the same size as the room. So it's sort of like about 5 meters by 4 meters kind of thing. And there's just this couch and there's Anthony, one of the OG Wiggles, just playing some notes,
So you were the curtain raiser for the Wiggles?
I think we clashed with the Wiggles, and the Wiggles are probably pretty pissed that we took a big chunk of their audience.
That must be the latest they've ever played. 5 o'clock.
Yeah. The audience was pretty steamed, and some different shit going on.
Oh, wow.
But no, it was in some ways the fourth time I've seen the Wiggles.
And was the event, I'm guessing, swimming in people proffering AI solutions to everything? Yeah.
I mean, and it was not all kind of. Sometimes AI stuff, like when Sam Altman talks and kind of just casually expresses that 95% of what is currently done by marketing and advertising people will be sort of featureized and just available to anyone else. It might be true, but it also, the guy just raised $6.5 billion. And sometimes it's hard to disentangle things that they think will happen versus things that it's in their business interest to advance publicly versus things that could possibly happen, but are you such a domain expert across every single industry that you can confidently know which parts of it can be collapsed and which parts are actually trickier than they think? So you're always trying to have that conversation in your head. I mean, the thing that happened to me while I was over there actually that kind of messed me up the most wasn't from South by Southwest Festival. It was what you did with my Canadian Compromise thing where you just chucked it into Notebook LM, a Google product, and it produced a 10-minute podcast. And I shouldn't send it to everyone we were traveling with because I was like, this is a better and more entertaining product. And apart from the fact the way they pronounced Dunedin, you'd never really confidently guess that wasn't a real thing. And that kind of fucked me up.
We've got this article from the Spinoff, and they lay out what's happening.
It's fascinating, though, because this isn't just a New Zealand thing. This whole clash, it's like looking into this global power struggle that's playing out right now.
Oh, totally.
Between governments, these massive tech companies, and then you've got your good old traditional media outlets all trying to figure out how to exist in this digital age. It's a mess.
It's a lot.
I mean, the truth is with that is once you do 3 or 4 different versions of it, you get used to some of the particular kind of idioms that they use and they start sounding robotic. But this is their first iteration of it. I mean, it's going to be amazing. The idea that you could, if you're a sort of person who learns, if you're the person who likes podcasts, and that may be some of you who are listening now, it is an incredible tool that I can imagine that we will use not to do party tricks. There's that, look, there's some made up people, but actually to kind of use as a way to understand material. Like you could take several long form articles on a subject that you wanted to understand better, feed it into this Google tool, and then get a couple of people having a conversation about it that you could use and as a way of absorbing that information, and because it's information that you've provided to them, you're not going to get these hallucinatory elements from out into the wild World Wide Web. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, and it's not all kind of doom for writers and writing. Like there's, I think, for example, like that you can now train an AI to read, to basically do a perfect simulacra of your voice with about 90 seconds worth of material. I mean, for any kind of voice recognition banking ID services, that's quite a scary thing. But equally, the idea that you could go to a Spinoff story and, sometimes you want to read the thing, but sometimes you wouldn't mind having it read by Toby's dulcet tones. I'm sure a lot of people would be very satisfied with that as a product feature. Or equally, the podcast version, those things can just be buttons at the top of it. So those are the kind of the positive versions of it. And, you just have to, it's just such a fundamental change to the way that we think about the craft that we've spent all these years learning, that it just takes a while to kind of process, and you don't settle on a fixed location with it,
We were talking about our weekends, which is what we're extending into this podcast now. And you were talking about Sydney, and just, it's an exciting place to be, isn't it, when you go there? This is slightly stretching the media category a bit.
Well, but it is a bit. I mean, because so we were hanging out with Chris and Hal Crawford, the former head of 3 News/News Hub, and Sam Kozlowski has also been on this podcast, the head of the Daily Oz, so just talking with Australian media people, and you kind of can feel how dynamic, there are things about the Australian media scene which aren't great. I think
the Channel 9 story.
The Channel 9 story, which dropped while we were there, which Chris addressed very...
Can you summarise that quickly?
Summarise the story?
Yeah.
Basically, they had a culture report drop in a similar style to the MediaWorks one of a couple of years ago, that where some high-profile DJs left the station around the same time. Not saying there's any connection, but basically, this report issue just called it toxic. Talked about rampant bullying.
Jurassic behaviour.
Yeah. They talked about Prison Island, which wasn't actually a reality show running on 9, but what happened to people when they kind of crossed some of their superiors, and you'd just basically be ostracized from the organisation while still working there. Chris, he was there during that period, but he denounced the thing. He basically came in as part of Fairfax and just walked into it was very much a 9 culture. 9 is a big TV channel there, and he was just absolutely blown away by it. But I thought it was quite brave and unusual for someone who was so close to it to be willing to not to just kind of wave it away with the kind of usual NDA type stuff, but actually addressed it head on.
It's interesting with that because it feels almost anachronistic. It feels like the sort of thing that used to emerge quite routinely, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, those sorts of exposés. And that there's another example of that in the advertising world, or the media/advertising world, where Campaign Brief was faced a kind of waves of criticism after publishing a spread with all the executive creatives, and they were all white men, conscious that in our particular podcast studio right now, that's also an issue, but there's only 2 of us.
That's true. It's this has been a massive kind of long-running controversy ever since they published it. It came out there's a print publication called The Work, which acclaims the best agencies based on the quality of their work, and lo and behold, a jury which has always been kind of critiqued for being disproportionately older white creative directors thought that they looked around, they decided that it was older white guy creative directors who'd done the best work. And it sort of bubbled along for a while. We actually had a copy in the office and we're sort of marveling at it. And Billy from Daylight said and wrote something addressing it a few weeks ago, and it has sort of slowly built and built and built to the point where Campaign Brief, this organisation which has got a kind of a stranglehold, which it's built in a very strange way over the creative sector, has finally, it's always been this sort of very dominant organisation, but people were sort of fearful of it, and but rightly so, from the way it was run. But you're seeing organisations as big as Colenso, which were once quite notorious for having toxic and misogynist cultures of their own, are saying, actually, we've had enough of this. And yeah.
There's a fantastic newsletter that you forwarded to me written by Tim Burrows of Mumbrella fame,
yes,
in which is headlined A Reckoning, in which he describes Michael Lynch, the kind of force behind Campaign Brief forever, just about.
Yeah.
Who's this extraordinary...
Just a creature of Australian media, right?
Ego. Like, I mean, the sort of... I was saying, having watched the first episode of Rivals, he sort of seems like something plucked out of that in a way. But some very, shall we say, assertive patterns of behaviour that he'd run. And it does feel as though it might be one of those sorts of things with the Colenso statement and a few others. It sort of, once you start pulling away, some of that, the house of cards can collapse. It seems to have been designed so much as though, I was talking to someone I know in advertising who described it as a necessary evil, and particularly pointed to the comments threads, which have been unbelievably toxic over time. And yet, in recent days, Lynch, after the comments thread became full of people criticising Campaign Brief, has changed the policy on the comments, and you now must provide your full name and email address and so on. So it is one of those interesting kind of feels as though a bit of an antediluvian media, the remaining antediluvian media empires are under stress.
Yeah, I think that's right. And those things can be maintained for a long time. And Lynch's particular method, according to Burrows, amazing story, I do recommend you read it, was he had a recruiting firm, had a stake in a recruiting firm that operated within the same kind of advertising creative sectors. And if you crossed him, they'd just start targeting your staff, and it's just which is obviously incredibly destabilizing for an organization, introduces chaos and cost. And so, yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, Australia still does feel like it's kind of 5 years behind us in terms of the extent to which it's creative media, advertising, TV, that whole soup of economies are being destabilized. But equally, the cultures that sort of were allowed to continue because those systems were maintained are also starting to fall apart. Anyway, all this on my weekend. We haven't even gone to yours.
Oh, thanks for asking.
Tell me about you went to the first game of the Black Knights at Go Media Stadium.
Auckland FC. They haven't started quite calling them the Black Knights yet. I think they're going to probably try and smuggle that in at a certain point, get it going as Auckland FC first. It'd be interesting to see. So there's very little. Black Knights, when they first announced the team, that was around about. They did a launch. I've got a sticker with Black Knights on it. But in the opening kind of weekend and the big media push, it's been Auckland FC. Anyway, it was a fantastic event. It was one of those things you thought, God, I'm glad I was here. I'm glad my son was there to experience it. It's got this real sense of energy about it. It's got people singing in the what they call the port, which is like the Auckland Ultras, but nicer. A blue flare went up. There was just a generally fantastic energy on a beautiful Auckland afternoon's day. And that in itself is great, especially if you like football, but it also, I think, points to something about Auckland, and this goes to Sydney when you go there and sometimes feel deeply envious, one does, that Auckland kind of getting its shit together it's having a football team, I think, is part of that. Having the Warriors, who's so successful, packing out that stadium, Go Media Stadium, Mount Smart, for the second half of the season, basically.
The whole season.
It was the whole season.
Yeah, it's never been done before in the NRL.
And so this coming in the first game, whereas I was reading somewhere that in the first 4 or 5 games of the last Auckland football franchise, they collected about 20,000 attendances in total. So this is a real energy. And at the same time in the weekend in Auckland, we had Diwali kicking off. We had the Arts Foundation Laureate Awards on the Friday night. The Breakers played on Saturday night at Spark Stadium. And it just has an energy about the place. And you think, well, the other thing is that my son caught the train to the football. He went with some of his mates and caught the train to the football, and he went, man, that train is cool, because he almost never catches the train because the trains only serve particular parts of Auckland, not one where we live. And that train, when that goes in 2026, is this a media conversation? I don't know, but it made me feel very optimistic about the potential of Auckland to become the kind of city that a population of this size warrants.
So the way that I relate this back to media is that when you're in Sydney, for all of the challenges and the kind of, like you said, the antediluvian elements, it's a big international city, and you feel that everywhere you look. I mean, the first night we were there, Olivia Rodrigo was playing. The next night, Travis Scott was playing. There's just this kind of like it's heaving, and Auckland doesn't feel like that. There's a broader economy that is in trouble, and that always has a kind of a force multiplier effect onto media, as we've kind of traversed on this podcast a lot. But I sort of nodded at this in a piece I wrote about the launch of Full-Time, the Warriors Bar, that there's this kind of, the Auckland FC's launched the Sky City Convention Centre, which is where, the Sydney's equivalent was where South By was, the launch of the City Rail Link, these sort of infrastructure pieces, sporting infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, or a facility that can play host to that, transport infrastructure. The city just feels kind of a mess at the moment. The optimist case is that comes in and starts to kick it up a gear, and hopefully that generates a different engine of the economy, which can start to address some of the travails that the media is suffering. Should we talk about one of those, which is the production sector?
Yeah.
Which you're quite familiar with. Your wife Emily works in it, and know a lot of people in it. What's the sort of vibe coming out of it now?
Yeah, I mean, I should be careful in saying I'm not an expert in the film TV production sector, but yeah, it's clearly, as with so many parts of the wider media sector, under a lot of pressure. For a long period of time, there were 5, the big 5, I think they call them, production companies, and that's South Pacific Pictures, Screen Time, Great Southern, Greenstone, and Warner Brothers Production. And recently Warner Brothers Production have lost their scripted part of it, which I saw someone from one of the aforementioned companies over the weekend who said the 5 is now 4. And I don't know whether that's quite right, whether Warner Brothers Production will continue as far as I'm aware, but it's getting smaller and smaller. The remaining 3 group are moving over to their HQ in which is Warner Brothers Discovery, which is separate but ultimately linked. They're moving over to their College Hill premises to fill some of those desks, and it's tight. I mean, there was that memo that you mentioned that was put out by Irene from SPADA, and it feels as though everyone is fishing in a retracting pond in a way. There are some bright stories too, mentioning that. That's slightly collapsed in other ways, that idea of the big 5. And you look at a company like Kevin & Co, who are starting to, who've made Taskmaster for Australia, who are managing to do things innovatively in and around. So in a way, that fragmentation that we've seen across so many parts of the media, I think, is now hitting the production sector too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I spoke to a friend who worked on a reality show that ran for many seasons, finished up last year, and was the kind of thing that in normal times, the commissioner would just keep pumping it out, like it was just working. And because we have, as we have referenced, this sort of terrible ad market, it was cancelled not because of a bad audience. It rated very well, but just because TVNZ has pulled back so much, as has Warner Brothers Discovery, the broadcast behind 3, that they're just doing very little local commissioning. And so at the top end, that's that's why Irene talked about $50 million of commissioning coming out of the local market, because New Zealand On Air, that's roughly $100 million or so, which goes to a particular kind of show. But there used to be all these commercially funded productions, reality shows, format shows that they were sustaining. So this person I was talking to, that was part of how they paid their mortgage, and now they're ironically talking about looking at Sydney, and that's how you sort of feel that sort of sense of contraction, how it is expressed. For an individual, that $50 million, it's not like it just goes shipped straight off to Banijay or WBD. Actually, a lot of it rotates, circulates around in the local creative economies.
And the reality of so many of those shows that some people can be sniffy about at times, whether it's a Border Patrol or a My Kitchen Rules or whatever, those are the ones that provide the support for the hard costs that mean that you have the people and the offices and the stationery that can then take a risk on smaller, scripted, more innovative shows. And those ones are the ones that are really under pressure. So it's tough. It's tough to keep that sort of thing going.
Yeah, and all credit to Kevin and Co, the way that they've developed a show like Spelling Bee and sold that into to Australia. These are really significant. New Zealand as a cultural exporter, that's a fantastic story. But you think about Kevin and Co.'s origin story, it was making shows for local broadcasters. That's how it got its legs under it so that it could start to do that. And so as you get the local cultural economy shrinking away, and we don't currently have anything that suggests that we're going to do like they do in Australia and try and force the big streamers to commission a bunch of local content. And so Netflix don't really commission here. Amazon don't commission here. So, we have this government which is quite laissez-faire, which says there's actually already a lot of support for the screen sector through things like the screen production rebate. That's true on one level, but there are other levers they could be pulling as we sort of move towards a small handful of platforms controlling everything that are being pulled in other countries that aren't happening here yet. What we are seeing, and this is what I think is quite interesting, is there are these institutions which the government can influence in different ways, largely by ministerial appointments to lead them or to govern them. And Mad had a fantastic piece last week about the way that the Human Rights Commission's Race Relations Commissioner and Human Rights Commission themselves, the appointees weren't part of the sort of the first list, and in fact seem to have been kind of inserted relatively late in the process and against some of the advice of the committee making that should have been, that would typically suggest an appointment. And New Zealand On Air, so Philip Crump, who I've had on this podcast and I think is an interesting character for this media system, but is very much an avowed conservative and has a particular point of view that certainly there hasn't been anyone like that anywhere near the New Zealand On Air board for quite some time, is now on the New Zealand On Air board. What did you make of that appointment and what it sort of might portend or suggest for that sector?
Fascinating. And I thought immediately when I saw it too of Madeline Chapman's story about the appointments to the Human Rights Commission. We're in a coalition government and different coalition partners are sometimes asked, as it appears happened in that HRC appointment process, for their ideas. And we will find out. I'm sure that many OIAs have gone in already. Many official information requests have gone in already for the mechanisms by which Crump was appointed to that board. which is, of course, opposite because, as has Thomas Cranmer, former nom de plume, when he went on to Newstalk ZB Plus and now running his Substack, he's a busy user of the eye and good. Look, I think that one thing I think is really clear is there should be room on boards for organisations such as these for people who are of the right. I think it's ridiculous to suggest that these should be clubs of people who are sympathetic to a particular persuasion or other. And I think sometimes perhaps they've been open to those criticisms. Whether or not Philip Crump is quite the right person to plug that gap, I think is different. His experience, he's described as having a strong background in media, and someone from NZME responded to me in a message, ha, 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 given his experience with Newstalk ZB Plus, which I know you wrote was a very good idea, and it definitely was looking to fill a niche. That didn't work out. There may have been reasons of timing, but there wasn't a suggestion that Crump was necessarily involved with colleagues at NZME, whether it's across the Herald or across Newstalk ZB. I don't know. Maybe it will be fine. The legislation is clear that they're not to get involved, and the board members are not to get involved in individual projects. He's a very intelligent man. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on him, having interviewed him. So I don't think necessarily one should assume that his plan is to tip the table up. The one thing that did concern me, I suppose, was when I saw a post by Reality Check Radio, the media media enterprise from Voices for Freedom, the anti-vax conspiracy group, posted, congratulations, Philip, and were very, very enthused about it, with lots of balloons and streamers. That troubles me slightly.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know Philip a little, and I originally wanted to do a piece on him. I thought, I saw that there was a lot of hate being generated when he was anonymous and pseudonymous.
You're going to do the big unmasking piece.
Yeah, and he'd agreed to that, and then Business Desk sort of did it, not quite a doxing, but certainly without his cooperation and against his wishes. But which is fine, all in the game. Yep. But certainly, so I through that period had met him and talked with him, and I don't think he's unprincipled at all. I think he genuinely holds these positions, and if you read his writing, while I don't agree with most of what he stakes out, you can see that he is trying to kind of lay out an argument in a sort of sophisticated and reasonable way. It's interesting, right, to think about, but he is very much a person who writes from the perspective of and espousing fairly traditional social conservative values, and if you think about what New Zealand On Air has commissioned in recent years, or funded, but it is functionally commissioning in a lot of ways, because most people are submitting more projects than they get funded for. Therefore, they are sort of selecting which ones they think individually and collectively make the most sense. To have Crump on that board, kind of, you're going to see a different type of show, and you're going to see some of the sort of assumptions that were baked into those shows. Like it's just, there's no way that it won't change, and how the production sector that we were just talking about, how the platforms that put forward shows, how they respond to that will be quite interesting, I think.
I mean, you're saying that you think the appointment will have a direct impact on the sorts of shows that are commissioned. You think there's a through line there?
Yeah, I
don't think that's necessary. I think it will change the dynamic of the board. He's one person on a board. The legislation, when I saw Richard Harman posting it on Twitter, it's clear that they're not to get involved in individual funding decisions.
But the board approves of any
Over
show
$1 million.
over $1 million. It goes to the board, and they have discussions about it.
Sure.
And so ultimately, I don't think it can help. Otherwise, why would you have a board of an organisation like that? Certainly, with the remit that the New Zealand On Air board has, which is to kind of interrogate those kind of shows. Even the fact of having an association with Reality Check Radio, which I didn't previously realise.
Oh, to be clear, they endorsed him. I don't know that he endorses them.
Yeah, well, I thought that I thought the endorsement said something like about our own Philip Crump. Anyway, that's even were it to be he has a greater openness or thinks that New Zealand On Air should interact with platforms like, say, the platform or Reality Check Radio that are outside of what were considered sort of acceptable media in a New Zealand On Air context, that's very destabilising or challenging anyway. So just something to keep an eye on there for sure. Lastly, we're very nearly out of time, but I did want to note the end of Matt and Jerry, who had a very long run on Radio Hauraki, and which ended couple of weeks ago when Matt Heath made an emotional. Actually, did you hear the end of it?
I watched some of it on social media afterwards. It was a bit teary. It was quite moving.
I found it really moving, especially for two guys who have spent so much of their time speaking drenched in irony or just plain surreal, just doing weird blokey jokes. It's often very sophisticated and running 2 or 3 games at once type stuff. I'm not maligning them, but you didn't hear naked candor from them. But that wasn't their bag. But to hear both parties speaking really openly, emotionally about what their friendship and making that show together has meant to them over that decade plus that they've been doing it. I thought it's actually a beautiful thing to see that played out to an audience that is largely young men. We sort of know what their fan base is, and I thought that was quite sweet. There's a way to end it.
And interesting that Matt Heath has gone to Newstalk ZB to that afternoon slot where he's sort of working in tandem with someone who used to produce that show. I think it's a great move for NZME and for their radio stable, because Heath is he's written this book, much acclaimed book, and he's kind of a stealth intellectual, And so I think some of that, he's read all those philosophers and thought quite deeply about the what humanity, those sorts of things, which probably are hard to get through all the time in the Hauraki format. And so I think that's a really smart appointment. I think it will give him a chance to probably spread his wings a bit more. Interesting to see what happens to Jeremy Wells, right? Because I imagine that they will be very keen to lock him into that chair, at least for a period of time while they do a transition. I don't think a new co-host has been announced yet, has it?
Not as far as I'm aware.
But I would love to see what Jeremy Wells does next as well, to be honest with you, because I think there is a point at which you sort of age out of some things, and he is an incredibly intelligent person. Like, you listen to him on the ACC, on the Cricket Collective, when he's just doing the straight cricket commentary, arguably our best commentator on cricket in the country, and then of course there's penis jokes and stuff, and if you're into that, that's fine. But I think he could kind of do anything. He's on 7 Sharp. He does the job perfectly well. That's what the job is. But I mean, it would be great to see him kind of let loose, whether it's in TV or radio. I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Hauraki looked like it was. You could imagine it just disappearing 6 or 7 years ago and being replaced with a different format station. But when they gave it over to basically the people who did the sort of weird TV comedy in the 2000s, so you had Back of the Y, Eating Media Lunch, and Moon TV, all of whom were basically given shows on that station. I think Mike Lane probably had a big hand in that during his time in that chair, and subsequently David Riddler. But that sort of they took that humour which was sort of bubbling in a kind of a late night TV context in the 2000s and kind of made it mainstream to the point of it is now probably our main kind of vernacular sensibility for a big chunk of men, and that sort of rescued Hauraki as a station. Jeremy is now basically the last survivor of that group, and very, very important to sort of holding the sort of rebranded Hauraki together, from a just a very commercial kind of type perspective. But and I'm sure he'll be very well compensated for that. But as you say, that there are sort of multiple futures for him. But the ZB succession thing is really interesting to me. I think, Mike Hosking, obviously probably the most talented pure broadcaster in the country, setting aside his politics. He's just shows up, has complete command of anything that's put in front of him. There's a reason why he is rated number one for sort of 20-odd years.
Brilliant.
But he represents a particular sort of flinty, conservative worldview, which is associated with essentially the baby boomer generation, with which he is one of the last kind of members to join the cohort. There's no suggestion that he's going anywhere, but there's a sort of Ryan Bridge and Heather Duplessis-Allen feel like they are spiritual as to him, and they basically will be on some level, they're 30 years long.
Yeah.
30
and
years.
And when Hosking was away recently, Heather Duplessis-Allen filled in on Breakfast Show and did a very good job. And did Ryan Bridge go? I don't know if he did go to evenings, but that's the natural progression one imagines, right?
Absolutely. And, it might well be, and that's the way of all things, that they'll both be competing for the slot should it ever become vacant. Good luck to them. But there is an alternative path where they say actually that sort of style of conservatism will ultimately age out. Obviously.
Wait a second here. Are you leading up to that after Hosking leaves, Matt and Jerry are going to do the Newstalk ZB morning show?
I don't think that's going to happen. And I do think that it's much more likely to be Heather or Ryan. And both of them would do very well. I'm no doubt in that. Mm. But I do think what ZB has done with this is brought themselves some optionality and the ability to test whether that what they built as a Hauraki audience can be ported across to talk and be given a kind of, it's necessarily a much more serious show. It's much more news-oriented station. But there is an ability to take it somewhere else and see what that does. And they've got the ability to kind of play with that now. Maybe there's another station. Because you look at Marcus Lush, who's now an institution there and wins every year in his late night show. Also XBFM. He comes from that same milieu, right? You mentioned optionality, which I'm a big fan of optionality, as you know. But I just wanted to float one other thought to take us out, which is if Jeremy Wells does move away from Hauraki and they're looking for a couple of strapping lads, a couple of lads out on the lash, a couple of youngsters, Duncan, just throwing it out there to the NZME bosses. We do like classic rock. We love a bit of classic rock. We love grunge. We love grunge. Yeah. And we love just being the lads. We love being the lads. We love our lads. We're a couple of Americans. Te Ai here is also one of our lads. Yeah. And I imagine we could travel the country drinking large beers and making, just being the lads. Yeah. So, just a thought. No, look, it's a great thought. And we'll just leave that there. We've been making podcasts for a long time, and as far as I know, we haven't even been approached to do breakfast radio yet, it's a colossal system failure, an indictment on New Zealand media. New Zealand media isn't working, it's broken. Shut it down. Yeah, I think so. So let's leave it there. Thank you, Toby. Thanks, Duncan. Thank you, Te Ai here, for putting up with this again. And we'll see you next week.